Hauptmann Erich Wagler wrote 9 words in his field notebook on the night of January 3, 1945, somewhere in the frozen woods east of a Belgian crossroads town no map agreed on the name of. We hit them with everything. They stood up again. He underlined it once. Then he closed the notebook and did not open it again for 6 days. This is not a story about that town, or about the war in general, or about victory, in the way the newsreels told it. This is a quieter story. It's about what happened when a German officer who believed he had already seen the worst that war could offer met a unit of American paratroopers who, as far as anyone could tell, had simply decided that falling back was not a thing they were capable of doing anymore. Wagler was not a green officer chasing his first medal. By January of 1945, he had 4 years of continuous combat behind him, and 4 years is a long time to spend learning what soldiers do when things go wrong. He had commanded a company outside Smolensk in the winter of 1941, when the cold killed more men on both sides than the rifles did. He had fought through the hedgerow country of Normandy in the summer of 1944, retreating in good order when the order made sense, because a competent officer knows that retreat is sometimes the only intelligent choice on the board. He had, by his own later account, developed what he called a working theory of the infantryman, a private set of rules about how far men would go before something in them broke and told them to stop. The theory had never failed him. Soviet conscripts broke at a certain casualty percentage. British regulars broke at a slightly higher one, and broke quietly, in good order, the way a disciplined army is supposed to break. Even the SS units he'd served alongside, for all their ideological fervor, had a breaking point, a moment where the math simply became too obvious to ignore. Wagler believed, as most professional soldiers believe, that this was not a flaw in men. It was a fact about men. Somewhere inside every soldier there is a number. When the casualties or the cold or the hunger cross that number, the body makes the decision the mind is too exhausted to make consciously. You fall back. You survive. That is what soldiers do, and there is no shame in it, because it is simply how human beings are built. He wrote that theory down in the spring of 1944. He would spend the winter of 1944 and 1945 discovering, crossroads town by crossroads town, that it was wrong. The 219th Parachute Infantry Regiment did not exist before the autumn of 1943. It was built, deliberately and from nothing, at a training ground in the pine country of the American South, out of men who had one thing in common and almost nothing else. Every one of them had raised his hand. Nobody was assigned to the 219th. You applied. You were tested past the point most men consider reasonable, and roughly 6 out of every 10 who applied did not make it through. The men who built the regiment's training program were not interested in producing soldiers who followed orders well. The army already had plenty of those. What they wanted, according to the training memoranda later studied by post-war analysts, was something closer to a soldier who could function as his own officer, indefinitely, in total isolation, with no possibility of resupply or rescue for as long as it took. Colonel Everett Marsh, who commanded the 219th from its activation until the end of the war, put it to his junior officers in a phrase that circulated through the regiment until it became something close to scripture. I am not training you to win. I am training you to not know how to lose. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that matters. The training itself was engineered around a single principle that the worst moment of a soldier's career, the moment of total isolation with no support and no clear path forward, should not feel unfamiliar when it actually arrived. So the men of the 219th were dropped, individually and in pairs, into hostile terrain with minimal rations, and told to make their own way back to a rally point 60, then 80, then 100 miles away, with no map, no radio, and instructors playing the role of a hunting enemy. Some men were captured, a dozen times in training. The lesson was not to avoid capture. The lesson was that capture, isolation, and disorientation were simply Tuesday. They were not emergencies. They were the job. By the time the 219th jumped into combat for the first time in the summer of 1944, its men had spent 9 months being trained specifically for the condition the Germans would spend the following winter trying and failing to force them into. There was a second element to the training that the regiment's official records mention only in passing, but that veterans who survived the war would later describe, in interviews decades on, as the part that actually mattered. It was called, informally, the Long Walk. Every candidate, near the end of selection, was taken alone to a patch of unfamiliar forest, given a compass, 3 days of rations, and nothing else, and told simply to reach a checkpoint. No instructor followed. No safety net existed. Men who quit during the long walk did not wash out on a technicality. They walked to a farmhouse, used the telephone, and were driven back to base in silence, and everyone in the regiment knew by evening who had made that call. Colonel Marsh was asked once, by a visiting war correspondent, what the long walk was actually supposed to teach a man that 3 days alone in a forest could not teach in 3 hours. His answer, recorded in the correspondent's notebook and later reprinted in a 1946 magazine profile of the regiment, was this: "It doesn't teach him anything about the forest. He knows how to walk before he gets here. What it teaches him is what his own voice sounds like when there is no one left to perform courage for. Most men, alone, with no audience, start negotiating with themselves by the second day. Ours don't. We don't know why. We just know how to find out which ones don't, and we build the regiment out of them." The first contact came at a road junction outside a village whose name appears in German records simply as Kreuzung 4. A 12-man squad from the 219th's 2nd Battalion had been sent to hold the junction for what their orders described as the shortest possible time consistent with denying it to the enemy. They held it for 11 hours against what German records identify as elements of a full infantry company, backed by 2 self-propelled guns. Feldwebel Hans Riener, who led the 3rd assault on the position, wrote in a report filed 2 days later, "We took the position and lost it, and took it and lost it. Each time we believed the defenders reduced to the point of collapse, and each time fire resumed from the same positions within minutes. I counted the muzzle flashes myself. There were never more than 8. 12 men had held the position with 8 functioning weapons for most of the day. Riener's report does not speculate on what happened to the other 4. It does not need to. The report ends with a single line that was later flagged by an intelligence officer reviewing captured documents. Request clarification on whether this unit received reinforcement. I did not observe any arrive, and I do not understand how they are still shooting." 2 days later, a company strength element of the 219th was cut off in a forest position when a German armored thrust closed behind them, severing any route back to friendly lines. By any conventional calculation, the company should have surrendered or attempted a breakout that would likely have cost most of the men their lives. They did neither. They dug in deeper. Lieutenant Karl Brandmeier, whose platoon was tasked with reducing the pocket, wrote to his sister in a letter later recovered from a mail sack captured by Allied forces, "There is a company of Americans in the trees ahead of us who know they are surrounded and have decided to treat this as an advantage rather than a crisis. I do not understand the logic, but I have stopped trying to argue with results. We attacked twice. We took the ground both times. Both times, within the hour, someone in the trees decided the ground still belonged to them and made the case with rifle fire until we agreed. The pocket held for 4 days before a relief column reached it. When it did, the relieving officer found the survivors of the company still organized into fire teams, still rotating watch, still, in the words of the after-action report, conducting themselves as though the encirclement had been a training exercise rather than an emergency. On Christmas Eve, a squad of 6 men from the regiment's reconnaissance platoon was assigned to observe a farmhouse suspected of housing a German command element. What began as a listening post became, within an hour, a direct engagement when a German patrol stumbled onto the position in the dark. Corporal Elias Bowman, the squad's senior NCO, would later describe the next 40 minutes to a regimental historian in terms so understated they barely qualify as description at all. "We were seen, so we did the job anyway. Wasn't really a decision. There wasn't another option on the table." What the German patrol's survivors described was rather different. Jeffreiter Otto Lindqvist, one of 3 men from the patrol who survived the engagement, told his interrogators the following week, "6 men held a farmhouse against 14 of us for the better part of an hour, in the dark, and when we finally withdrew, they did not pursue and did not celebrate. They simply resumed their positions, as though nothing unusual had occurred. I have fought since 1940. I have never encountered soldiers who treated combat with that particular kind of eye. Do not have the German word for it. Boredom is not correct. It is closer to certainty. The largest single engagement came 3 days later, when the regiment's 1st Battalion was ordered to hold a snow-covered ridgeline that commanded the approach to a supply road the Germans needed desperately to move armor forward. Hauptmann Wagler himself commanded the assault force sent against the ridge. It was here that he wrote the 9 words that opened this story. His full report, filed the following week, is worth reading in its entirety, though only a portion of it survived translation intact. We committed 2 companies with armor support against what our intelligence estimated as no more than 80 defenders. We inflicted, by conservative estimate, casualties equal to 1/3 of that force in the first assault alone. The position did not fall. We inflicted further casualties in the second assault. The position did not fall. I requested artillery support and received it. The position did not fall. At no point during the engagement did the volume of defensive fire meaningfully decrease. I have served 4 years. I have seen units destroyed to the last man rather than yield ground, and I recognize the difference between that and what I witnessed on this ridge. Those men were not dying in place out of fanaticism or desperation. They were, as best I can determine, simply continuing to do their jobs, the way a man continues driving a nail after the first several blows have not seated it. There was no despair in it. There was no heroism in it, in the theatrical sense we are trained to expect. There was only continuation. Wagler's men took the ridge on the 4th assault, a cost he described as disproportionate to any tactical value the position could reasonably be assigned. When they reached the summit, they found 19 surviving defenders, low on ammunition, still organized, still under the command of a wounded staff sergeant who, according to Wagler's report, gave the order to fall back only after confirming that every wounded man capable of movement had already been evacuated, and not 1 moment before. The final major engagement of the campaign came on a stone bridge over a half-frozen river, the last crossing point available to German armor attempting to reach a fuel depot the 219th had been ordered. In language one surviving order simply describes as at all costs, to deny them. A single platoon, no more than 30 men, was given the bridge. They had 2 anti-tank guns, insufficient ammunition for either, and no realistic hope of resupply before the engagement's outcome would already be decided one way or the other. Major Dieter Falkenrath, who commanded the armored column sent to force the crossing, filed a report that German intelligence officers would later circulate to other divisional staffs as a case study, not notably in how to defeat such a position, but simply in how to understand one. The bridge was defended by what I now believe to have been fewer than 30 men, against a column that included 6 armored vehicles. I do not say this to excuse the 11 hours it took to clear the crossing. I say it because I do not believe any officer reading this report will credit the figure without independent confirmation, and I would not have credited it myself 24 hours earlier. Both anti-tank guns were destroyed within the first 90 minutes. The defenders continued to engage our infantry, and on 3 separate occasions that I personally witnessed, engaged the vehicles themselves at ranges that gave the men involved no realistic chance of surviving the attempt. 2 of those 3 men did not survive it. The 3rd did, and continued fighting from a foxhole 11 meters from a burning Panzer Roman IV, apparently unconcerned that the vehicle was still capable of firing its machine gun in his direction. The bridge held until nightfall, when the surviving defenders, 9 men, 3 of them wounded, were ordered to withdraw by a runner who had crawled the last 400 meters under fire to deliver the order in person, because the platoon's radio had been destroyed hours earlier, and there was no other way to be certain the message would arrive. Falkenrath's column crossed the bridge the following morning. By then, the fuel depot had already been evacuated and stripped by American engineers, and the crossing, in his own words, had cost us a day and accomplished, in the end, nothing that the day itself had not already been spent buying for the other side. Private First Class, Walter Dukes was 20 years old, from a small farming town in Nebraska, and by every account from men who served with him, entirely unremarkable in temperament, quiet, polite, the kind of soldier officers described as steady, because there was nothing more dramatic to say about him. On the ridge, on December 27th, Dukes manned a machine gun position through 3 assaults after both other men in his crew were wounded and evacuated. When his weapon overheated and jammed during the 4th assault, he continued firing his sidearm, and when that ran dry, held the position with a trench knife until reinforcements reached him. Asked afterward by a war correspondent why he hadn't fallen back when the machine gun jammed, Dukes reportedly shrugged and said, "Wasn't nobody else on that spot. Seemed like somebody ought to be." It is not, on its face, a remarkable sentence. It contains no rhetoric, no appeal to flag or cause. It is simply a description of a man's private accounting of his own responsibilities, delivered with the same tone he might have used to explain why he'd fed the cattle before breakfast. Sergeant Rosa, first name lost to a records fire in 1973, known to the men of his platoon only as Sarge Rosa, was the staff sergeant who held the farmhouse position with Corporal Bowman's squad. A veteran of the regiment's earliest training cadre, Rosa had a reputation among his men for a particular kind of calm that some found unsettling. One private, interviewed decades later, described it this way: "Rosa never looked scared. Not because he wasn't. I think he was just as scared as the rest of us. He just already decided fear wasn't going to be the thing that made his decisions for him. And once you decide that, I guess it starts showing on your face." Private Miklos Varga, the 3rd survivor of Falkenrath's burning Panzer Roman IV, was the man Falkenrath had watched fight from a foxhole 11 meters from a tank still capable of killing him. Varga was 22, the son of Hungarian immigrants who had settled in a Pennsylvania mill town, and had enlisted, according to his own later account, mostly because his older brother had already gone and someone needed to write their mother letters she could actually understand. When a reporter tracked him down after the war and asked what had gone through his mind as he kept firing at a burning tank 11 meters away, Varga considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Wasn't thinking about the tank, really. Was thinking about the 2 guys who didn't make it. Figured somebody ought to finish what they started, and I was the one still standing there, so." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Didn't feel like a decision. Felt more like the only thing left on the table." It is a small detail, but it recurs across nearly every account gathered from the regiment's survivors, the same flattening of language, the same refusal to describe what happened in terms grander than simple continuation. None of them, when asked, reached for the word brave. Most of them, like Varga, reached instead for some version of the same idea, that there had been a job, that they were the ones present when it needed doing, and that walking away from it had simply never registered as an available option worth considering. The report that travelled furthest up the German chain of command came not from Vogler, but from General Kurt Ahlwardt, the divisional commander whose forces had spent 9 days attempting to clear the 219th from the sector around Kruzung 4. Ahlwardt's memoir, written in the early 1950 while he was living in relative obscurity outside Hamburg, devotes an entire chapter to the engagement, longer than his treatment of any single action, from 4 years on the Eastern Front. "I had, by the winter of 1944, developed what I believed was a reliable understanding of the limits of human endurance in combat," he wrote. "I had watched entire divisions reach those limits and act accordingly, and I did not consider this weakness. I considered it simply the truth of what men are. The regiment we encountered in the Ardennes did not appear to have limits I could identify through any method available to me. We inflicted casualties that should, by every precedent in my professional experience, have ended organized resistance. Organized resistance did not end. I do not offer this as an excuse for our failure to clear the sector. I offer it because I believe it is the most honest statement I am capable of making about that winter. We did not lose because they were better armed, or because our men fought poorly. We lost because we were operating on an assumption about the outer boundary of human commitment, and that boundary, in their case, was simply somewhere we never found." He closes the chapter with a sentence that his editor apparently wanted removed, and that Ahlwardt, according to a note in the manuscript margin, refused to cut. "I have spent 8 years trying to decide whether what I witnessed on that ridge was courage, as we are taught to understand the word, or something else for which I do not have a name. I have concluded that it does not matter which word is correct. What matters is that they did not fall, and we could not make them, and there is no comfort in any explanation I have found for why. Erich Wagler survived the war. He was captured in March of 1945 and spent 14 months in an Allied prisoner camp before being released into a country that no longer resembled the one he had left. He never published a memoir, but a single page from his personal notebook, donated by his family to a small regional archive in the 1980, contains an entry dated some years after the war, written beneath the original 9 words from that January night. Beneath, we hit them with everything. They stood up again, in a different ink. Added later, he wrote one more line. I have spent my whole life since trying to understand what makes a man stand up again. I no longer think it can be explained. I think it can only be witnessed, and I witnessed it, and I have not needed an explanation since. The Germans in that sector, in the weeks that followed, began referring to the 219th with a phrase that outlasted the battle and in fragments outlasted the war. Translated roughly, it meant the ones who don't fall. It wasn't meant as a compliment when it started. By the end of that winter, in the mouths of the men who used it, it had become the closest thing to one they had left to give. They fired everything they had. The men on the ridge stood up again. That is the whole of the story. That is all it ever was.